LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the April 25th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the 11 best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for which it'd be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. I've got about 30 minutes of clips, a little over 30 minutes of clips, so I'll probably have a little over 30 minutes of commentary to intersperse between them, and they're mainly on my title topic, Police Reform Now, ? And that is kind of a loaded topic. I did a live stream, a Sunday live stream almost a year ago now, closer to a year ago, because May 25th was the killing of, or now the murder of George Floyd. We can call it a murder since we had the guilty verdict this week. You may remember last week I gave the likelihood of various outcomes, and that was actually the third most likely outcome. I thought compromise verdict was most likely, hung jury second most likely, and then guilty on all counts as third most likely, acquittal fourth most likely. So, of course, if you know the weather forecaster says 30% chance of rain and it rains, does that means he was wrong? Well, anyway, it just shows that that someone who's watched a lot of these things in the past has a less optimistic view than what actually happened. But that was the main topic of all the Sunday morning news analysis shows, was where do we go from the Derek Chauvin guilty verdict in the murder of George Floyd. And I will have a bunch of news summaries on that. I will have some perspective from the newsmaker guests. I have, like I said, Kamala Harris, the vice president, was on CNN State of the Union talking to Dana Bash. I thought it was not that great an interview, kind of a softball interview. I'll talk about that when I get to that clip. Karen Bass, from a California member of the House of Representatives, who's one of the people spearheading the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that is the police reform at the federal level, that it will be the main topic of a lot of the newsmaker commentary. Then also show Lindsey Graham at the end, saying that there is no systemic racism. If you want to know why there is systemic racism in the criminal justice system, I recommend reading this book here, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, over my left shoulder. But before I get to the main topic, COVID is still a topic, and that I'll talk about a little bit, and how I'm now fully vaccinated plus 2 weeks, so I'm as good as you can get after getting the Pfizer vaccine. And you'll see one of the news summaries actually mentions that we're getting to the point where the supply of the vaccine is actually going to outstrip the demand because of vaccine hesitancy, and so I'll talk about that topic. And that has a little to do with the political comedy clip I chose from Fox News this morning, not Fox News Sunday, but it's Sunday Morning Futures with Maria Bartiromo. She had on Senator Rand Paul, and I just thought it was ridiculous what they decided to criticize President Biden about with his climate summit. The two criticisms, the first one's pretty ridiculous, and then the second one is totally ridiculous, as I will talk about with you a little more after you watch this ridiculous Fox News clip from this morning together over here.
At this point, this past week, President Biden had a climate summit. I thought it was really ironic that Xi Jinping was one of the featured speakers, since China is, of course, the world's biggest polluter. But look at this shot that we have of the virtual summit. This was a virtual summit led by the White House. The only one wearing a mask is Joe Biden. You've got leaders from across the world sitting there virtually, and he's got a mask on. What do you make of this?
I guess this means that Dr. Fauci has now determined that you can get COVID, you can catch it through your webcam. That's the only thing I can conclude. But really it's silly. And this type of theater really is distracting to people who need to go out and get the vaccine. We have a lot of people, particularly those over age 40 and those who are overweight, who all need to get the vaccine. And that all of the vaccines, the risks of the vaccines are less than the risks of the disease, particularly if you're over 40 and overweight. But when Biden goes on the computer screen to a Zoom call and wears a mask, he's making a mockery of the science. And this is dissuading people who are skeptical anyway. So if you want to convince people who are skeptical that the vaccine works, show them that we have protection after we've been vaccinated. Show them after we've had the disease naturally that we have protection, and don't be excoriating people to keep wearing masks after they already have immunity. Let people live again. But by doing this sort of fake science and wearing a mask while you're on a Zoom call, it shows great ignorance of science, but it also tells the people that you're really being dishonest with them, and they tend not to believe the other things that you will tell them.
Yeah. By the way, in that shot, I think it's really also interesting to point out that President Biden is the only leader without a flag behind him. Everybody has their flag. We don't have the American flag behind Joe Biden, interestingly. Real quick before you go, Senator Josh Hawley and Mike Braun.
And I actually saw that flag part. I think it was David Pakman tweeted it this morning, and I actually posted a Twitter response. If you follow my Twitter, twitter.com/LiberalViewer, my reply was something like, and you notice you never see Biden hugging a flag either, because, of course, that's one of the famous shots of Trump, but David Pakman didn't show that whole ridiculous thing about mask wearing. One of the things I thought is what I saw Lulu Girl said in the live comments, like, you don't know who's around Biden in that shot. He could be near somebody. And, of course, the real criticism, the thing that killed people, was the refusal of the former president to wear a mask, especially in public. I think he did it on like one brief occasion or a couple brief occasions, and he belittled people for wearing masks. And where was Maria Bartiromo and Senator Rand Paul when all that was going on? And we're not even at the part of the pandemic where it's time to take the masks off, because we haven't gotten to the herd immunity yet, and we're just getting to the level of scientific knowledge where the experts are starting to tell us that people who, like me, have been doubly vaccinated plus 2 weeks, or once vaccinated with Johnson & Johnson plus 2 weeks, that those people really can't transmit the virus, which was one of the things they were worried about. Now there's more data coming in on that, but anyway, I just thought that whole thing was ridiculous, and you can continue to let me know what you think in the comment section. Now I'm going to get to the newsmaker summaries, and I always, or almost always, say that Chuck Todd has the longest and best news summary. He starts with an introduction, then goes to this pre-recorded package, and I think there are actually two great things about the NBC News Meet the Press. And I know there are people out there who hate Chuck Todd, and one of the things I point out is what I'm complimenting here isn't just Chuck Todd. It's really it's the producers of Meet the Press. I think he may have a production role. I'm not sure, but he's like reading and then reading the narrative for the pre-recorded video package. So this is an entire NBC Meet the Press product that I'm saying is good. And what I really like about the beginning of this, maybe some of you saw this on the internet after the Derek Chauvin verdict. Some people were tweeting out the initial report that the Minneapolis police put out about what happened to George Floyd. And it's ridiculous. And this is something I've said for a long time. I used to be a public defender. That's someone who defends people accused of crimes who can't afford a lawyer. And I did that for about 5 years. And so I got to know a lot of criminal cases from the inside, especially from some of the other lawyers I worked with who had the more high-profile cases that were in the press. And one of the things I learned is the things you read about in the press, the media almost always takes their police sources and then just prints what they say. That's the story you see in the press all the time. And a lot of times it's far from the truth. And I think that there's been some reassessment in the media recently that they shouldn't just give the police version as the version, but it's usually like inside sources. And, you know, a lot of reporters have their police sources, and they basically are used as a vehicle to set the narrative. And you'll see that at the beginning of this Meet the Press news summary. And then at the end, Meet the Press does a good job of uplifting the voices of people who are really impacted by the lack of police accountability and transparency, and seeing how they reacted to the Derek Chauvin verdict. So having done all that introduction, I guess I will now show you the Meet the Press clip. It's over 5-minute news summary, but well worth watching and discussing after we watch it together over here.
And a good Sunday morning. Millions of Americans felt a combination of grief and relief experiencing both the trial and the verdict of Derek Chauvin last week. But even as much of America exhales, it does help to remember this: the initial statement from the Minneapolis Police Department. Here's how it read. Officers were able to get the suspect, George Floyd, into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later. He appeared to be suffering medical distress. That's all that was said. Did Derek Chauvin's trial and conviction change anything? It's hard to know. Right now, there are calls for video to be released in the fatal police shooting last week of Andrew Brown in North Carolina. But most cases of alleged police brutality against African Americans do not have video that puts the lie to statements like the one the Minneapolis Police Department put out. Most cases aren't televised, gavel to gavel. Most cases don't have the whole world watching. Yes, there are some hopeful signs that Democrats and Republicans can work out a compromise on police reform. But until the country feels the criminal justice system is fair, when there's no benefit of video and no spectacle, we won't really know whether things have changed or if justice was served only in this one particular case. In the past few days, we've been asking a number of African Americans what the trial and verdict means to them.
When the verdict actually came in, I sat there steadfast, looking at the TV. Just so many things was running through my mind. Will we get justice this time, or won't we? Because so many times we thought that we would get justice and there was no justice. Just like in my son's case.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
This right here is for everyone that been in this situation. Everybody. Everybody.
When the verdict was announced, I got quiet because I just wanted to sit with this moment.
Someone just took 1,000 pounds off my shoulder. And with each successive verdict, there was just a little bit more weight lifted.
And this, to me, was an effort on behalf of 12 men and women to repair a fault in our system.
No peace! No justice! No peace!
I was happy that the nation could see that there may be a change coming about.
I guess a way to describe it could be that of relief, maybe hope for the future, but in reality, not real joy.
I can't believe it. It feels, there's poetry in the fact that he couldn't breathe, and it feels like we just got a breath of fresh air.
George Floyd was dehumanized by Derek Chauvin. The courts are now holding Derek Chauvin responsible, but our society has been dehumanizing Black bodies. And so as a country, we must hold ourselves and each other accountable.
We, the jury, find George Zimmerman not guilty.
7 years ago, I thought there's no possible way that this man could walk free for killing a child for no reason. It wasn't just Trayvon.
I am a son of a police officer who died on my third birthday, and I am the stepson of a prisons officer. I think the majority of police officers get into the system because they want to protect and serve. And so we have to give them the tools to protect and serve, and tools that don't include just firearms and tasers and things that bring force, but tools that bring the community together.
I think we saw in the trial that law enforcement can join this movement because we all want to be better.
We got to do better recruiting. The training is good. You just got to have good people to be trained.
For young Black men to fulfill their potential and have their humanity amplified, I want my 16-year-old to live in a country where he can feel that.
And even with my grown son who's in his 30s, I still remind him, don't forget, be mindful. When you get pulled over, turn the lights on, put your hands on the steering wheel. Don't make any sudden moves, because I need you to come home and tell me what happened. I don't need to go to a morgue to find out what happened.
Well, somebody referred to it a Selma moment, and it could very well be that. I certainly hope it is.
Now is not the time to sit and watch. Now is not the time to keep quiet. Now is not the time to enable. And we're stepping into a point in history in which you want to look back and know that you did what you could.
And joining me now to discuss the Chauvin verdict and its implications for policing are Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. She's also, of course, the former Hennepin County attorney. And she's also author of a new book, Antitrust, about taking on monopoly power. We also have with us the Baltimore Police Commissioner, Michael Harrison, and historian Keith Mays. He's also the Associate Professor of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota. I want to bring...
So that was a good panel. I'm actually going to have an NBC News Meet the Press clip from Michael Harrison, the commissioner of the Baltimore Police, talking actually about something Trevor Noah said about the whole bad apple metaphor that you hear about. There, you know, there are just a few bad apples in the police department, and I'll discuss that when I get to that clip. If you're, there's the links down in the video description to my clip list. I forgot to say that earlier. Also, there are links down in the video description to the source of all my clips, including that full Rand Paul interview with Maria Bartiromo this morning. If you want to subject yourself to that, I don't recommend it. And like I said, that was a great news summary from NBC News Meet the Press. And I think it was well worth the 5+ minutes of giving all those different perspectives on the Chauvin verdict. You even saw like a clip of Michael Zimmerman getting away with killing Trayvon Martin. There wasn't as much of a focus on some of the recent killings, like especially Dante Wright, who I talked about last week, or Andrew Brown, who you'll see talked about slightly incorrectly in this next news summary from CBS News' Face the Nation. But they're both much better than the lack of any news summary about the police reform issue that you'll see from Fox News Sunday in the clip after next. But now I'm getting way ahead of myself. I showed the CBS News Face the Nation clip. They always have had great COVID coverage, as I always say. And they talked about some of the problems in India. Well, there were a couple of people talking about India on the news programs. I'm not really covering that, but that is like a real crisis, and not only bad for India and the developing world and the world in general, but even bad for the United States. As I was talking about when it came to Republicans not getting vaccinated last week, I was saying how even though it seems like, survival of the fittest, that means there'll be less Republicans. But no, it actually affects not only are Republicans human beings who have value and we should care about, I said that last week too, but also the fact that people don't get vaccinated means that there's more virus spreading. It can mutate into variants that aren't as controlled by the vaccine every time it spreads to a new person. And it also gives a reservoir of victims for the pandemic to stay alive and come back in a surge later. So those are bad things, and especially bad given what you hear at the beginning of this CBS News Face the Nation news summary here from John Dickerson, where he talks about what I said at the beginning of the program, that the demand for the vaccine or the supply is going to actually outstrip demand. There's like more vaccine available than people who want to get vaccinated, unfortunately. John Dickerson is in because Margaret Brennan's out for another maternity leave. Congratulations, Margaret Brennan, wherever you are. And I'll talk about what they did wrong with the Andrew Brown shooting when Mark Strassman, reporting from Atlanta again for no apparent reason on police reform, in this clip.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. We are at the point now where the supply of COVID-19 vaccines may soon outpace demand, in part because some are hesitant to get vaccinated. And we have some new findings from a CBS poll on that issue. But we want to begin this morning on the topic of police reform. CBS News senior national correspondent Mark Strassman is in Atlanta with this report.
Tell me what you need, what you really need. Back in this weekend, intertwined demands for racial justice and police reform. An American movement sparked by an American moment. George Floyd dying face down on a Minneapolis street.
There has been a systemic problem that has persisted for a long time that has covered up murders at the hands of police in the Twin Cities and across the nation.
Catharsis this week. Former officer Derek Chauvin was convicted of murdering Floyd.
Justice for the moment was served. We have a long way to go.
But communities of color everywhere say they're tired of the knee on their neck. And week after week, outraged by police killing more people of color. Like 16-year-old Micaiah Bryant in Columbus, Ohio. 13-year-old Adam Toledo in Chicago.
We are not playing games. Charge the officer now.
Dante Wright, shot by a cop in a Minneapolis suburb. And Andrew Brown Jr. in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. Deputies serving Brown a warrant last Wednesday shot him in the back. After protests every day since, city officials announced Saturday they've started the process to release the body camera footage.
Elizabeth City is a microcosm now of what is going on across the nation.
Since George Floyd's death, more than 30 states have passed new police oversight and reform laws. Those reforms will curb the use of police force, impose civilian oversight, and expose bad cops. But there's also backlash in red state America, fueled by episodic violence during protests over the last year, and a sense the left has lost it. A handful of states have passed new laws intended to curb street protests.
This bill actually prevents against local governments defunding law enforcement.
Governor Ron DeSantis called Florida's new law anti-riot. But to critics, that reaction's proof any progress feels precarious, and that Black Lives Matter remains a call for action instead of an American reality.
If we're going to change our culture, it's going to be because the community demands it.
Mark Strassman reporting in Atlanta. We go now to Governor Mike DeWine.
And why was Mark Strassman in Atlanta? I've talked about that for a long time, but a couple other things that I would say about that Mark Strassman news summary. There's a little bit of both sidism there when he went into the Republican backlash about the violence in the streets and how that, I mean, comparing how people react to police violence to the police violence itself, it's not really good journalism to make them seem, it's not a fair comparison, at least if you don't show one as a result of the other. But the other thing that I said I was going to comment on before I showed the clip is the Andrew Brown shooting in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. You saw Marcus Strassman reporting how city officials said they'll begin the process of releasing the video. And I actually watched that entire Elizabeth City press conference where the mayor and the police chief, but none of them were involved with the shooting of Andrew Brown. That's the thing that wasn't really made clear in the news summary. That, I've actually worked on police reform. They talked about states with police reform. One of the things I did this last week was I lobbied for a police reform bill in California, SB 2, which helps decertify officers. It's like sort of a licensing thing so that officers can't move from one police department to another. But I've worked on a whole bunch of bills and also local issues, police oversight, both in the city of Sacramento and the county of Sacramento. In the city, and I think this is also true in North Carolina, Elizabeth City, the police chief is hired by the city council or the city manager, whatever, and can be fired by the city council or the city manager. But in the county, there's a sheriff who is independently elected, and the city has no power over the sheriff. In fact, even the county board of supervisors here in Sacramento has limited power over the independently elected county sheriff. And one of the things I've been working on for a long time is getting a community-based oversight board for our county sheriff with subpoena power, which seems on the verge of happening. And anyway, that's a big, long tangent I don't want to go into. But you noticed in Mark Strassman's report, they didn't really explain it. They said that Elizabeth City was beginning the process of releasing the video, but it's the sheriff, the independently elected sheriff's video, and it looks like the sheriff is requiring a court order to get it released, and that is a very low level of transparency. But I don't even know, I'm a little skeptical after all these years of working on sheriff oversight that there should be independently elected sheriffs, because it's kind of crazy that they're not under some other type of civilian control. And I was thinking of like a metaphor the other day that it's like, you know, how the president, we have civilian control of the military. So the president is commander-in-chief and the Congress investigates things that happen in the military and funds the military. But suppose we had like civilian oversight of the military, but like generals in the Marines were independently elected and had independent authority. That would be like so unworkable. But that's kind of like how independently elected county sheriffs work. And I'm not sure it's the greatest of systems. It goes all the way back to like the Shire Reeve in England, but that doesn't make it good, I guess. But you can let me know what you think down in the comments section. And now I'm going to show you the Fox News Sunday News Summary, which is really short. They usually have a reporter give a news summary after Chris Wallace's introduction, but they don't do that this week. They go right to Lindsey Graham and then Karen Bass on police reform, and they basically, I don't know, it's like maybe Fox News Sunday didn't want to show some of the footage you saw in the last two news reports to their viewers, like police misconduct. They don't want to show it, and they're so pro-police on Fox News during the week, and not just in prime time, but even during the day. It's for someone who's worked for police accountability and transparency and used to be a public defender, it's kind of sickening to watch, honestly, but I still watch it just so that I can explain to you what's going on with Fox News. And I will talk about the Fox News Sunday News Summary. It's the last three news summaries are all around a minute. This is about a minute and 20 seconds, which I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. For the past 25 years, we've been asking the key players from D.C. and beyond how their policies and actions shape our lives. And while we'll celebrate our anniversary a little later, today is no different. President Biden marks his own milestones this week. On Wednesday, he'll address a joint session of Congress for the first time. A day later, he'll mark his 100th day in office. Ahead of that, we have new Fox News polls on the state of his presidency. When it comes to job performance, 54% approve of how Mr. Biden is doing, while 43% disapprove. To compare, Barack Obama had 62% job approval at his 100-day mark, and George W. Bush was at 63%. But Mr. Biden is doing better than the 45% approval Donald Trump had 4 years ago. We'll have more polls later this hour. But first, Congress is trying again to reform the nation's policing laws in the wake of the guilty verdict in the murder of George Floyd. In a moment, we'll talk with Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass, sponsor of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. But we begin with Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's working with fellow South Carolina.
And I will have, like I said, I will have a Lindsey Graham clip coming up, or my last newsmaker clip before my bonus Dash and Sandy clip. You know, I didn't show the Dash and Sandy clip last week. Do you want to see the 15-second Dash and Sandy clip that I didn't show last week? Because I have a brand new, over a minute, extra bonus Dash and Sandy clip because I feel guilty for not showing it last week. Anyway, here's the Dash and Sandy clip from last week. You can kind of hear Dana Bash in the background. That's why it kind of fits here, because I think you'll hear Dana Bash in the background while Dash and Sandy go out a doorway and into a hallway last week over here.
Against him, which is in contravention of international law. Second, we have communicated to the Russian government that what happens to Mr. Navalny in their custody is their responsibility, and they will be held accountable by the international community. In terms of the specific measures that we would undertake, we are making that.
well, that wasn't Dana Bash, but it was CNN State of the Union with Dana Bash in the background. That was the bonus Dash and Sandy clip that I signed off without showing last week. I apologize for that. But to make up for it, I showed last week's clip, and then after the Lindsey Graham clip, I will show a over 1 minute bonus Dash and Sandy clip that shows just how aggressive Dash is getting. Dash the cat is trying to eat Sandy the dog's food. So look forward to that, and remind me at the end if I don't do it. I can't mess it up 2 weeks in a row. But anyway, here's Dana Bash giving the State of the Union this week, where also talking about the Derek Chauvin verdict. Every week it's the Jake Tapper started saying, what is the State of the Union this week? Well, this week it's wondering how much things have changed, which would have been a good point to put in what the Minneapolis Police Department originally said about the murder of George Floyd that Chuck Todd put at the beginning of Meet the Press. That doesn't show up here, but it's a much shorter, well, you can tell me how you think it compares to the other news summaries after we watch together.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, where the State of our Union is wondering just how much things have changed. In the days since George Floyd's family and communities across America celebrated the Derek Chauvin guilty verdict, the nation has felt both hope that things are changing and despair over new police shootings. Now, a bipartisan working group in Congress says there is momentum to make real progress on policing reform, an effort that failed just last summer. And the White House says police reform will be a key part of President Biden's first address to a joint session of Congress Wednesday night, part of an ambitious agenda he hopes to pass with the slimmest majorities in the U.S. Senate. As the nation waited to hear from the Chauvin jury, I spoke exclusively with Vice President Kamala Harris about her history-making role, the weight of the responsibility that brings, and how and when President Biden seeks her advice.
Now, I don't know, is that really new? Why is this interview been held for so long? Why the timing? Because she said, you heard in the introduction to the Kamala Harris interview clip I'm going to show in a few minutes, that Dana Bash said, while we're awaiting the Chauvin trial verdict, I interviewed Vice President Kamala Harris, and that verdict came Tuesday afternoon, or it was like 2 o'clock Pacific time, I think 5 o'clock Eastern time, about when that verdict came. So that means this interview came sometime on Tuesday before that, or maybe Monday, who knows, because the jury took the case on Monday. So why are we only seeing the Kamala Harris interview the following Sunday? That seems like old news almost at this point. And there was a good part of the interview I'm not going to show you a clip of, but the part I am going to show you I thought was pretty vacuous, full of like softball questions. How does it feel to be the first, woman of color, et cetera, as vice president in this situation, and not enough real insight. I have bad memories of Kamala Harris from when she was Attorney General in California, and I was fighting for some of these police reform bills as an ACLU activist, and she was not all that supportive, even though when I first started volunteering with the ACLU of Northern California, the executive director was Maya Harris, Kamala's sister. But anyway, that's a big long tangent I didn't mean to go into, and maybe I'll talk a little more about Kamala Harris when I get to that clip. But the next clip is the shortest of the news summaries. It's ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Also, I think kind of over-concentrating on the faux State of the Union thing with Biden and Tim Scott. You saw mentioned at the end of that Dana Bash news summary. Here's George Stephanopoulos this morning over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. Nearly a year after George Floyd's horrifying final moments shook this country to its core, a Minneapolis jury delivered justice. The guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin was unequivocal. But as deadly shootings continue to raise questions about American policing, calls for reform are accelerating. In our new ABC News Washington Post poll, 60% of Americans say the country should do more to hold police accountable for the mistreatment of black people. 42% say the president is doing too little to reform policing practices. Both President Biden and Republican Senator Tim Scott expected to focus on the issue when they address the nation this week. And our first guest is the top House Democrat charged with negotiating police reform, Congresswoman Karen Bass. Welcome to This Week. Thanks for joining us this morning.
And I will have a clip of Karen Bass, that interview. She was also on Fox News Sunday. Not a clip from Fox News Sunday, but from This Week with George Stephanopoulos on ABC. That news summary was, okay. It was short. Could have been some more in-depth reporting, but like I said, I preferred the first longest news summary from Meet the Press. But now you've seen all 5. You can let me know what ranking you think they deserve, having watched them together. And now I'm going to get to this long clip of there was a very long interview, like I said, that Dana Bash did with Vice President Kamala Harris. And this is a large part of the interview before the first commercial, and then Dana Bash came back after the commercial with an extended part of the interview. That second part, actually, I thought was really worthwhile, where Kamala Harris talked about the so-called border crisis. I've been criticizing the term border crisis for weeks, because the crisis isn't like all the people coming knocking at your door. It's, what is the thing that's driving them to be, frantically knocking on your door asking for help. And Kamala Harris talked about her long-term commitment to seeking a solution with the Northern Triangle countries. I think last time I talked about this, I called them the Golden Triangle, which I think is in Asia somewhere. But the Northern Triangle, that's Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, where a lot of these refugees are coming from. And Kamala Harris has a long-term strategy for that. That is not in this next clip. At a link down in the video description, you can click on CNN State of the Union. I think that rest of the interview is available, but the part I'm going to show you, I think, like I said before, is pretty vacuous. Softball questions. How does it feel to be the first? And this is the part where she's talking about the George Floyd verdict, and she, uses some flowery language about, this is a moment that's going to heal America's heart or something is in here, but nothing about, and talking about her personal experience, never really talks about how she used to be a prosecutor, a district attorney in San Francisco, attorney general in California, how she was actually on the cop side, how she was not the greatest advocate for police reform, police accountability, and transparency back in those days, and she compares her experience to Joe Biden's. Joe Biden actually was a public defender at one point, which I thought was one of the weird ironies in this. Anyway, I've introduced this clip multiple times during the show, and I guess over-introduced it, as is my wont, but it is like 5.5 minutes long, and I will talk about it with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
As the nation waited to hear from the Chauvin jury, I spoke exclusively with Vice President Kamala Harris about her history-making role, the weight of the responsibility that brings, and how and when President Biden seeks her advice.
9 minutes and 29 seconds, right? We all watched that video. Many of us watched it multiple times. And people are in pain over what we all saw in that video. And in fact, it was in large part because of that case that, together with my then colleagues, Cory Booker in particular, and then on the House side, Karen Bass, that we wrote the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I really do hope that the United States Senate, the House has passed it, that the United States Senate will take it on and have the courage to take it on, because there is no question that we've got to put an end to these moments where the public questions whether there's going to be accountability, questions whether there's going to be the kind of fairness that we should all expect and deserve. In all of our lives, and in particular as it relates to people of color, with a particular emphasis on Black and brown men in the criminal justice system as it relates to policing. This verdict is but a piece of it, and it will not heal the pain that existed for generations, that has existed for generations among people who have experienced and firsthand witnessed what now a broader public is seeing because of smartphones and the ubiquity of our ability to videotape in real time what is happening in front of our faces. And that's just the reality of it. And that's why Congress needs to act. And that's why they should pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
This is really a moment in America.
Yeah.
Racial tensions, as you just mentioned, they are really palpable. Your experience, your life experience, is different from every one of your predecessors.
Mm-hmm.
How is that bringing itself to bear right here in the White House?
Well, I think that, first of all, you'll recall that when Joe Biden asked me to join him on the ticket, he did so with a sense of intentionality, of purpose, knowing that he and I may have very different life experiences, but we also have the same values and operate from the same principles. But it was something that I know he was very intentional about in terms of asking me to run with him and to serve with him, which is that I will bring a perspective that will contribute to the overall decisions that we make. He and I are in almost every meeting together, have made almost every decision together. I'm not going to talk about our private conversations, of course, but I can tell you that it is often the case that as I will ask his opinion about things, he will ask my opinion. And through that process, I think that we arrive at a good place. And ultimately, of course, he is the president and he makes the final decision.
Do you feel a special responsibility, given the fact that...
Listen, I carry a great weight of responsibility, knowing that there are so many people, again, the generations of women who fought for and imagined there would be a woman vice president or a woman on the ticket. And I think of that all the time in terms of the responsibility I have to hopefully make them proud. I carry a great sense of responsibility for all of the young girls and boys of color, those who identify in some way because maybe no one expected something of them, but they expect a lot of themselves, to do well and to do right and to do good. So yes, I carry a great sense of responsibility, if not of the seriousness of the responsibility, to be in this position and be a voice for those who have not traditionally been in the room.
You mentioned police reform a couple of times. The House, of course, has passed the bill that you were a co-sponsor of when you were in the Senate, but it doesn't have, there's not a high hope for it to pass as is in the United States Senate. So, you talked about the fact that you have a special responsibility. The president talked about the fact that he would always have the backs of African Americans in this country. So will you and he get more involved in the informal negotiations going on, and if so, how?
Well, we've made our position clear, each of us, and as an administration, we've made our position clear, but it is for the folks in the Senate to work together to resolve whatever may be differences of opinion about the details of the legislation. But I think there's no question that the American people, in a bipartisan way, realize and want that there will be some reform of this system.
More broadly, there have been at least 50 mass shootings.
And Dan DeBash goes on to talk to her about guns and whether it should be put in front of infrastructure. And but like I said, you can see the whole interview at the CNN State of the Union link down in the video description. I pretty much pre-criticized that, and Kamala Harris did not give a lot of useful information about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and what's important about it. And I think the next two clips I'm going to show you, you're going to get more and more information in terms of both the federal police reform, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and also some of the, wider on the street movement ideas that, like I was saying, defund the police. I even work with people who believe in abolishing the police. So he will say reimagining the police, just taking a lot of the responsibilities away from people with guns and with this sort of like frat boy military culture, and giving it to like people who are actually going to help, protect, serve, whatever you want to say. And anyway, this next clip is Representative Karen Bass. She talks about the prospects for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. She's one of the co-sponsors from the House. And she uses the word informal here, that there are informal negotiations going on. That's my one criticism of George Stephanopoulos' interview, is he doesn't pick up on that word informal. I saw Karen Bass, and it didn't really come up in the Fox News Sunday interview that Karen Bass did, but in the interview she did with Jonathan Capehart, he followed up on it on the Sunday show with Jonathan Capehart on MSNBC. He followed up on it, and she said, well, they haven't gotten the leadership approval to do formal negotiations, so they're only doing like informal negotiations right now, but she expects within the next several days that there will be, and that means like Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, and I guess Kevin McCarthy, and Chuck Schumer, of course, and there are various other levels to the leadership, but that's something not picked up on here. But George Stephanopoulos does ask a good follow-up question about community problems and a more like wider perspective on not just police reform, but fixing some of the causes of the problems that the police are responding to over in this clip.
Let's talk about the issue of reform. As I said, our poll shows a solid majority for police reform. The legislation you've been working on would institute many changes, including a ban on chokeholds, no-knock warrants, and racial profiling by law enforcement. Where do negotiations stand this morning?
Well, first of all, we've been having informal conversations with one of the caucuses in the House called the Problem Solvers, which is a bipartisan caucus, along with Senator Scott and Senator Booker. And so I believe that we can get there. I absolutely do. What's most important is that we come up with ways to hold police officers accountable so we will stop seeing these videos. So ending qualified immunity, decreasing the standard that is needed to prosecute an officer, so we won't see so many times when we know that a person has been killed or brutalized, and then we find that they're not even prosecuted. And that's because the standard to prosecute officers is so high. We also need to raise the... I'm sorry?
You just hit on the biggest sticking points in the negotiations, though, right now. Senator Tim Scott, who is leading the Republican side on negotiations, says lowering that standard for prosecutions is not on the table.
Well, we still have to talk about it. Oftentimes, people say there are red lines, I won't cross them, and then in negotiation, we find a pathway forward. And I'm hoping that we will be able to do that. But it's also about raising the standard of policing in the United States. We have 18,000 police departments and no national standards, which is why you see some practices legal in some areas and illegal in other areas. And so I think that that is critical. And then aside from that, when we do get the bill on President Biden's desk, there will still be much more that needs to be done. We really do need to look at policing in America. And so we know that officers are trained to shoot to kill, but maybe much more emphasis could be placed on de-escalation. Why some incidences result in people being killed, maybe there were other ways to respond other than firing.
Some of the critics are saying you can't just invest in policing, you can't just focus on police reform, you have to invest in entire communities.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. And as a matter of fact, what we have done over the years is we have divested from communities. We've cut health care, we've cut social services, and then when there are problems that result, we expect the police to pick up the pieces. So one of the most glaring examples is with mental illness in our country. We don't treat mental illness properly, and then people get go into a crisis, and you wind up calling the police, then the individual gets killed. Why do we do that? Why do we incarcerate people who are mentally ill? Why don't we treat them, provide them health care and services up front so they don't deteriorate into a crisis? So when I said much more needs to be done, that is absolutely an example of it. We need to look at communities as a whole, and one of the things that the bill does is provide resources to communities to re-envision public safety. What do communities need in order to be safe? So I think much is needed to be done. I think the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act moves us a step forward. After it's signed by President Biden, we need to get started on all of the other issues that need to be dealt with.
President Biden addressing Congress and the country on Wednesday. What do you hope to hear from him?
Well,
So yeah, there you see again George Stephanopoulos going off into the faux State of the Union thing that you saw in the news summary that was a little bit overcovered, I thought, until we see, I guess, what actually happens. But I also pointed out how George Stephanopoulos didn't follow up on the informal negotiation point that Karen Bass made. But I thought Karen Bass, as I said before I showed the clip, did a much better job of giving the details. Talking about lowering the standard for prosecuting cops, that's something we did here in California. I covered it. That was one of the police reform bills I lobbied on, and the ACLU worked on. AB 392, changing the police use of force standard from the reasonable officer standard. You heard that all the time in the Derek Chauvin trial, if you watched that, especially the closing argument. That was one thing I forgot to say at the beginning when I was talking about how I said that the compromise verdict was most likely, and then hung jury, and then guilty is third most likely, and then acquittal fourth most. The one thing that when I made that prediction, I hadn't watched that terrible closing argument, and I used to be a criminal defense attorney, so I believe I can criticize. That was so long and rambling. I was always very brief because juries, at one point, if you watch the closing argument, the judge actually interrupted to break for lunch, which from what I saw from the reporting meant the jury was dying with this 2.5 hour, however long the closing argument was from the defense, and it didn't. I mean, you really want to send the jury, if you have any skeptical jurors about conviction, if you're doing a closing argument and the prosecution gets to give their little rebuttal at the end, so you don't even get to talk last, but you want to give them some really clear arguments to arm them in the jury room for what they're going to say when they're the holdout juror against conviction. And the closing argument did not do that at all. But I was talking about the reasonable officer standard that you heard that defense attorneys say over and over again. What would a reasonable officer do? That is the prosecution standard. But here in California, we changed it from reasonable force to necessary force. We put the word necessary in there with AB 392, which means that if there were, maybe the officer was in reasonable fear, but because of a situation the officer created or the officer could have de-escalated, those are all things that are now supposed to be considered under California's police use of force law, and that's what Karen Bass was talking about in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Not really well explained in that news summary. But in terms of police reform and the wider types of community reforms that Karen Bass was talking about, I think actually the best explanation came from Sherilyn Ifill, the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. I'm a huge fan of Sherilyn Ifill, and she does a great job of explaining a lot more of the nuances. Better, Karen Bass did better then Kamala Harris and Sherilyn, Ifill, I believe, is the explainer of the week, talking to John Dickerson on Face the Nation, and I will talk about her answer and explanation after we watch it together over here.
We go now to the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Sherilyn Ifill. She joins us from Baltimore. Good morning.
Good morning.
Sherilyn, there is a long history of protest and reform and struggle that has been in American life since the 60s. But something changed with George Floyd's murder. And I wonder, with the conviction this week, what you think changed and what you think did not change.
Well, I think what has changed since George Floyd was killed last summer is that people who have been in this fight for a long time, and let's be clear, many have been in this fight for decades, the issue of police violence against unarmed African Americans is an issue of the 20th century. We can go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century and find these incidents and find this unrest as Black communities have resisted this. It was a signature issue of the unrest in cities across the country during the 1960s, and we emerged from that decade with 3 core civil rights statutes: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But we emerged with nothing on the issue of policing and racism in policing. So I think where we are now, John, is that people are fed up, and that's a good thing, because it's time for a fundamental change. If you can recall, we've been in these conversations for the last 7 years since Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And there's been some tinkering around the edges. There's been some movement. The most powerful movement has been that the conversation has shifted away from talking about tinkering around the edges and modest reforms to radical changes and a radical envisioning of what public safety needs to become in this country.
Where should we put our focus what's an example of what you're talking about? In other words, not tinkering, but real reform.
Well, you look at places like the city of Berkeley that has decided that armed officers will no longer be involved in traffic stops or mental health calls, or the experiment happening in Ithaca where the entire police department is being set down for a new community solution and public safety corps. It will include some armed law enforcement officers, but it's focusing on the root causes of crime. It's shifting resources to mental health, to homelessness services, to youth services, and then it's focusing on what is it that you actually need armed police officers to deal with the most violent of circumstances. But the truth is, it's a re-envisioning of what public safety needs to be. Do we need officers of an armed constabulary to come out to address the possibility that someone is passing a bad $20 check? Do we need armed officers to come out and address a homeless person who won't leave your front stoop? We have to actually get into thinking about what public safety is supposed to mean, and not assuming that we have to continue the current structures, but being bold. What we've been doing, John, is something akin to all deliberate speed. You'll remember the admonition of the Supreme Court in the second Brown case, which actually slowed down desegregation. We've been moving at a snail's pace, and I think even for myself, I've been involved in this work for quite some time. There's just a fundamental shift, and we realize that reform around the edges is not going to do it. We're looking at Elizabeth City today. We're looking at Spotsylvania County, where there have been additional killings. We need the killings to stop, and that means we're going to have fundamental change.
I wonder if you think there's also common cause that can be made with a lot of police officers who express this sentiment when I talk to them. They say, you know, we're in a system where these communities we work in have been failed by education, by the job system. There are guns everywhere, and we're being asked to be go in there and sort of face all of these problems on our backs. And that requires a broader lens, too. Would you agree?
I agree. I'm so glad you said that, John, because this is the place when people talk about making common cause with existing police officers. It's not about having a pancake breakfast or playing basketball. It's about some real honest talk. Police officers need to begin to be honest about the fact that open carry laws and concealed carry laws actually make them nervous. It endangers them. They don't like people having guns on the street and having concealed carry and walking around with weapons. It makes them nervous. But you don't hear police organizations or law enforcement organizations telling the truth, the things that they will say behind closed doors about how they feel about these gun laws. It is also true that rather than actually solve the problems of our community, problems of education, problems of poverty, problems of homelessness, we have shifted all of the resources to deal with those problems into our criminal justice system. And we've used the criminal justice system as a holding pen for resolving the core problems that any healthy democracy has to solve. And that's the conversation we need to be having now. We are now in a moment where we should be able to look squarely in the face the issues that have to be addressed that relate to our young people, that relate to jobs, that relate to homelessness, that relate to the mental health crisis happening across the country, and that COVID will only exacerbate. We need to be putting our resources and attention to those problems and not shunting them off to the criminal justice system and asking police officers, armed officers, to address issues that we have been too cowardly to address as a democracy.
As a democracy, I guess I cut that clip off a little too soon there, but that was, like I said, a great explanation of what, some people call it reimagining the police, just changing resource allocations so it's not, like I said, the over militarized frat boys or I don't know, sorority women, or I don't know. There are of course female police officers. I should have mentioned that when I was talking about how they're frat boys or militarized frat boy culture. Just because there are women there doesn't mean it's not a frat boy culture. And in fact, when they talk about qualified immunity, one of the compromises you saw discussed was whether to make the police department and not the individual police officer more liable for lawsuits. And that already happens, that cities and counties are liable for all these bad acts by police officers. They settle with the families, and they also have political pressure often to do it. And what reminded me of it was, I was talking about the frat boy culture. Here, our sheriff's department had this whole sex discrimination, sexual harassment lawsuit, and cost the city, or it cost the county millions of dollars in settlement again, because of the independently elected sheriff here who's so bad that, well, whatever. I've made videos about the sheriff in Sacramento County before. If you want to go to my youtube.com/LiberalViewer channel and go in the little search across the channel box and put sheriff, and you'll see some videos about our bad sheriff. You can also actually do a search for AB 392 and find some stuff about how we changed the use of force standard in California, what I was talking about before I showed that clip. But Sherilyn Ifill, like I said, did a great job of explaining a lot of the nuances of the defund, reimagine, reallocate public safety resource thing that is going on the left that gets a lot of criticism over on Fox News. Like I say, I watch a lot of Fox News, and they're always saying, they're coming after the police and crime is spiking, and who are they going to call? And actually, the police don't really stop a lot of crime. Honestly, they more often they show up afterwards and write reports. And anyway, I want to show an actual police officer now. I talked about this at the beginning, that the commissioner of the Baltimore Police, Michael Harrison, was going to answer this. This is Chuck Todd showing Michael Harrison, the Baltimore Police Commissioner, a clip from Trevor Noah talking about the whole few bad apple metaphor, and Trevor Noah had a new take on it. And I think this clip in some ways shows how, the term Overton window, how the things that are discussable now and passable and implementable in our current politics, what is within the window of things people can actually discuss and not be crazy or whatever. That's the Overton window. I think I explained that, and it's definitely moved a lot in the last year since George Floyd, and you're hearing a lot more stuff from police officers, like you hear from the police officer in this next clip.
The systemic issue. Commissioner Harrison, here's what Trevor Noah said, and he was it was a different play on the bad apple metaphor. Take a listen.
The system in policing is doing exactly what it's meant to do in America. I feel like you get to a place where you go, oh, we're not dealing with bad apples. We're dealing with a rotten tree that happens to grow good apples.
Commissioner Harrison, do you understand where Trevor Noah is coming from?
I didn't hear that, but hearing it now, I do understand what that means. And that's why Baltimore Police Department, like my former department in New Orleans, is under a federal consent decree, and we are essentially in a complete makeover of a department. And that's why I believe the Justice Department will, in its investigation, probably find patterns and practices of unconstitutional policing, and it's very likely Minneapolis will be in a consent decree as well. Now, in our makeover, it is because the system was bad. Everything from recruitment to hiring to training to policies to practice and protocols, supervision, technology, all of it. And here's what happens with good apples. And I think Trevor was talking about where are the good apples. We have to have peer interventions. We have a peer intervention program in Baltimore, as we did in New Orleans, where we teach officers how to step in front of their colleagues when a bad act is about to happen. And what we need is for more good officers to step up without being retaliated against and without being punished for having stepped up to do the right thing to prevent those bad things from happening. And that's what we've been advocating for, and that's what every department should be looking at. There's a wonderful program called ABLE, Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement, taught at Georgetown University, where many departments are moving in that direction.
I guess the question Senator Klobuchar is going to be is
and the thing I actually agree with that police commissioner from Baltimore about is that an important consideration in the whole good apples, bad apples metaphor is the officers who stand by and do nothing, because the really bad officers I don't think are the majority of officers, but the number of officers who will stand by and even cover for the bad officers, that is way too high. And that was one of the things in the Derek Chauvin trial where police officers actually came out and testified against another police officer. That very rarely happens, and that is a big change in culture that I think is worthwhile that Chuck Todd got Commissioner Michael Harrison to talk about there. I don't know if he really got to the root of Trevor Noah's metaphor about the bad tree, that sometimes it may produce some good apples, but that is a long involved. If you want to know about systemic racism in policing, going all the way back to the old Jim Crow and also the new Jim Crow, I recommend this book by Michelle Alexander I was talking about. And if you want to see someone make a really bad argument that we don't have systemic racism, that's the final news clip I'm about to show you. It's Senator Lindsey Graham talking to Chris Wallace over on Fox News Sunday. I don't think Chris Wallace's follow-up about... he at least asks the question, but I don't think his follow-up is that great. And I will... Stop whining, Sandy. I will show you... I will try to get Sandy to stop whining while we watch this last news clip together, and then I will show you the bonus Dash and Sandy clip from breakfast this morning, which I won't forget. Oh, but before I get to that, I did want to thank the Super Chat contributors so far. I think I got a screenshot of that during... Here we go. So double thank you to Lulu Girl, and thank you Simple Solutions and Chairs Bed, and I hope Sexy Bob's okay. I'm not sure what that's all about, but last week's live stream, after manual review, they decided not suitable for advertisers, so no advertising revenue last week, I guess. I just saw that this got demonetized, and I requested review of that decision. It took all week also. I just got the answer like a few hours ago. So anyway, I appreciate the people who contribute through those Super Chat contributions. I appreciate the people who are give the direct PayPal contributions at the link down in the video description. I especially appreciate the monthly patrons on Patreon. There's a link for that down there. You can also press that join button underneath the video for YouTube users. All those things help support this channel financially when YouTube advertising doesn't really do it anymore. And with that, I will get to the Lindsey Graham clip I already introduced, giving a very bad argument against the existence of systemic racism on Fox News Sunday this morning over here.
What are the chances that we are going to see a compromise on police reform before May 25th, the first anniversary of George Floyd's murder? And how far are you and other Republicans prepared to go on lifting the immunity for police officers and lowering the standard for prosecutions?
Well, number one, we'd had police reform in the last Congress, but Chuck Schumer and Kamala Harris made a conscious effort to block bringing up Tim Scott's reform bill. They filibustered Tim Scott's bill because they didn't want Tim Scott and President Trump to get credit for it. There's no reason we shouldn't have done it last time. We'll try again. Qualified immunity is a very big deal. If you want to destroy policing in America, make sure that every cop can be sued when they leave the house. So there's a way to find qualified immunity reform. Take the cop out of it. My idea, along with Senator Scott, is you can't sue the police officer. You sue the department if there's an allegation of civil rights abuse or constitutional right abuse. We can solve that problem. We can solve the issues if there's will to get there, and I think there's will to get there on part of both parties now.
So you think there's a pretty good chance by May 25th you'll have a deal?
Yeah, qualified immunity. Yeah, I hope so. Tim is the leader on this. His package is bipartisan. Qualified immunity is a problem. I've been working with Senator Whitehouse. It's a pretty simple solution. Don't sue the police officer, sue the police department so the cop doesn't have to worry about losing his house and his entire, car and everything else that comes with being a police officer.
Senator, after Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder this week, President Biden said this. Take a look.
It was a murder in the full light of day, and it ripped the blinders off for the whole world to see. And this takes acknowledging and confronting head-on systemic racism.
Senator, is there systemic racism in this country in policing and in other institutions?
No, not in my opinion. We just elected a two-term African-American president. The vice president is of African-American Indian descent. So our systems are not racist. America is not a racist country. Within every society, you have bad actors. The Chauvin trial was a just result. What's happening in Ohio, where the police officer had to use deadly force to prevent a young girl from being stabbed to death, is a different situation in my view. So this attack on police and policing, reform the police, yes, call them all racist, no. America is a work in progress, but best place on the planet, and Joe Biden spends a lot of time running the place down. I wish he'd stop it.
We are coming up this week on Joe Biden's 100th day in office. As you know, of course, he's going to give that big speech to Congress.
So, yeah, no follow-up there from Chris Wallace on the, we elected Obama and now Kamala Harris, so racism over, no systemic racism. Not really addressing all the stuff you can read about here in the new Jim Crow, and not addressing how the Chauvin verdict was special, unusual, and it's in recent years the number of officers convicted has gone up, but it's a very recent phenomenon and hasn't really changed the police culture. And also the beginning of that clip was, I kind of pre-criticized a couple clips ago. I was talking about the people who wanted the Republican compromise to make the police department and not the police officer responsible, and that also there was kind of a weak argument. We don't want them to lose their house and their entire car, I'm not sure where that came from, but whatever. I guess he just got a little bit tongue-tied there, which happens to me a lot actually during my live stream, so I can't really criticize that. But the idea that the things that police officers would be liable for it would be beyond negligence. It would be, they'd have to be going outside the scope of their duty. I mean, right now, it's just so narrow, they are almost never held liable. Remember, I talked about the case from the Fifth Circuit several weeks ago, where they came and they tased a guy who had like doused himself in gasoline and threatened to kill himself and burn his house down, and they tased him. He set on fire, died, and his house burned down. So, not much saved there by police intervention, and yet the court found, because of qualified immunity, that nothing, the police officer couldn't, the tasing wasn't unreasonable use of force because there was no previous case where police had tased someone covered in gasoline. Oh, and one of the facts in the case was that right before they tased him, someone said, "Don't tase him, he's going to light on fire." Does that change your... Anyway, that's the real qualified immunity. It's like, doctors can operate even though they're liable for being sued. Why should police officers be so special? Anyway, you can let me know what you think down in the comment section. Like I said, that was the last news clip. I do want to finish up the show, but I don't want to deprive you of this week's Dash and Sandy clip. I did preview. Oh, I see another thumbs up super chat contribution from Lulu Girl. So three thank yous for Lulu Girl for the super chat contributions. And this is the Dash and Sandy clip I talked about earlier, where Dash the cat is getting more and more aggressive all the time. I give Dash one little piece of dog food when I feed Sandy the dog, and then I have to stand there and watch sometimes. You'll see. And of course Sandy, who's... Do you hear the whining right there? Sandy whining right next to me. Sandy is so sweet and gentle. They talk about how never get between a dog and his food. Well, Sandy does nothing when Dash the cat tries to steal her food. And that is the subject of the bonus Dash and Sandy clip. It's over a minute. It's like a minute and a quarter, since I feel bad for no Dash and Sandy clip last week. Minute and 11 seconds over here. Okay, Dash and Sandy, time for the bonus Dash and Sandy clip. You ready? Hey, stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. So yeah, he just settled for drinking the water there at the end finally. But I mean, talk about I drink your milkshake moment, or what a bold feline is that silly cat Dash. That's all I can say. And so anyway, I hope you appreciate the time and effort I put into watching all the shows, picking out the best clips, adding my criticism and commentary, and bringing it all to you every Sunday for over 8 years now, and at least for about another month, I think, till the end of May, I think is when I may be wrapping it up or moving it to Monday, or taking a break, or who knows exactly what's going to happen. I'll talk about that more in the next few weeks, but I will be back next Sunday and every Sunday for the next several weeks, and until next Sunday, I guess I will, or until I have some other reason to upload a video, and stop whining, Sandy. So yeah, until some other video or next Sunday, I guess. Oh, and I did see one last super chat contribution there from, is it Amakmule, or I'm really bad at pronouncing names, so I probably butchered that, but thank you for that last super chat contribution. And until next week or some other video uploading reason, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.